Welcome to our continued study of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Today we're on lesson number 3. We'll be covering 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 15. If you would like to contact us, our contact information is shown on the slide that should be on your screen right now. We'd love to hear from you if you have a question, feedback, or for whatever reason. We'd be glad to talk to you. Hope you would be continuing along with us throughout this study, as we'll move also to 2 Samuel after we've completed this study of 1 Samuel. We're glad to have you participating. We will be studying 1 Samuel, and we'll be looking at chapters 8 through 15. If you notice on our outline here, we're going to cover the second transition of Israel leadership as they move from Samuel, the final judge, to Saul, the first king. And we're also going to consider a good bit of the events that happened during the reign of King Saul. We notice that King Saul had both his successes and his failures. He had a situation in which he started out doing well. However, he did not end so well as his reign comes to an end, which we'll be considering in a future lesson. So let's consider now the fact that Israel demands a king. Now, this is something that we talked about in our introductory lesson. The fact that Israel came to Samuel and said the present situation is not satisfactory. We want a king like everybody else. So let's notice some of what chapter 8 has to say about that. Now, it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Unfortunately, it seems that Samuel followed in the footsteps of Eli, at least in this one category. Although he was a good leader, he seemed to be a terrible father, and his sons did not turn out to have the same character that he had. While he served at in the area of Gilgal, where much of the judgment took place as he judged Israel, his sons were serving in a place called Beersheba. As you see on the map here, Ramah and Gilgal, the cities where that Samuel stayed for the most part, and his sons judged down in the southern part, the southern border actually, of Israel, in a place called Beersheba. And they were not the kind of people that their father was, and the people were displeased with that. And so they gathered together at Ramah, where Samuel was at the time. And the text says, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. We notice a couple of things about the actions of Samuel here. First of all, he was displeased with this request that the people made by way of their elders who had come to see him there at Ramah. The word displeased literally means he was trembling with the emotion that it brought on. He was grieved and or angry, perhaps both of those he was feeling, knowing that God was being disrespected, but also aware that he was being disrespected as well because he was not satisfactory to the people as their judge. However, Samuel took the right action. He prayed to the Lord to see what the Lord would have him to do, and that is always the right thing. As we continue through chapter 8, we see that the Lord said to Samuel, when this request had been made by the elders of Israel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. As God continues to answer Samuel, he reminds Samuel that there's a pattern here, and it's a pattern that had been true of his people pretty much from the time they had left Egypt when he freed them from slavery there. And that is, the people would be loyal to God for a short period of time, and then they would drift away from him in a spiritual sense. They would get themselves in some sort of difficult situation, oppression, persecution, and they would cry out to the Lord to help them. And the Lord would take care of that situation. And then it would not be too long, in many cases, until that same thing happened again. So the Lord reminds Samuel, this is just something that's been happening all along, and it's really reflected of their attitude toward him, God, rather than simply Samuel. In verse 9, he says, now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them. And that's exactly what Samuel did. He told them that a king was not going to be everything they thought a king would be for them. It was not going to be all advantages as they perhaps thought, wanting a king just like the countries around them. He said he's going to take your sons and your daughters. He's going to put them to work. The sons would be in his army. The daughters would be doing work. There would be things that were demanded of him. He would take of their land and their produce and their animals, and it would be a cost to them, a considerable cost to have a king. Nevertheless, Samuel told them exactly what God had said for him to tell them, and that was that they could have the king. And so God selects a king for the people to satisfy their request. And as we come to chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, we see that Saul is the one who's going to be selected. Here's what we read about Saul as chapter 9 begins. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, and he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So the servant that God had chosen to be their king was someone with a great deal of promise. Saul was a good-looking king. He was one who would appeal to their physical expectations, perhaps, of what a king should look like. And the Lord knew, at least at this time, as Saul's reign began, that he was a man of great humility and that he had the potential to be a good king, even though that did not continue, unfortunately, for the duration of his reign. It begins, we're introduced to Saul as he and a servant are out looking for lost donkeys that belonged to his father. He's been searching for them, and he's been searching for a long time. In fact, he's been searching so long that they begin to reason that his father would probably be more worried about them not returning home than he would where the donkeys were. And so they decide that something has to be done. And so Saul decides that Samuel, being a man of God, would have the ability to tell him where the lost donkeys were. And so he makes his way toward Samuel. Now, as Saul comes to Samuel, Samuel has a message for him. And it's part of what Saul is looking for, but it's much more too. He assures him that the donkeys have been found, but he has a much greater lesson than that, a much greater message for Saul. And he's going to tell him about that. And he's going to tell him about that, he says, tomorrow. Samuel said, tomorrow about this time, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel. This is God's command to Samuel about how he was going to interact with Saul when he came. And so Saul does come to him, and Samuel tells him that I'll have a message for you tomorrow. And as God had said, as God had promised, Saul comes to him. Now, when Saul comes to Samuel, in a reflection of his great humility, we find that he is hesitant about accepting the fact that he could be a king. He said, I'm from the smallest tribe, Benjamin. I'm from the smallest family in that tribe. I'm from the smallest clan within that family. In other words, there was really nothing about his background, his resume, that would say this is a man who ought to be king. However, Samuel knew that this was who God had chosen. And of course, God knew that he was beginning here with a king who had the right kind of heart to be a leader. As we move into chapter 10, we find that Saul is anointed. Now we're going to notice that a period of time takes place between his anointing and his actual full introduction to Israel so that they would know he's going to be their king. It doesn't all happen in one set of events on the same day in the same place, but it's all going to start here in the first part of 1 Samuel chapter 10. After he has confronted Saul, as God told him he was going to, Samuel is going to anoint him as king. Beginning in chapter 10, we read that Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, "Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance?" Now, that may not necessarily say king to us, but obviously Saul knew what he was talking about when Samuel said that. He understood that he had it his mind to become king, which would have been surprising to him because of his humility, because of his background, something that was unexpected because this was not what he had come to Samuel to talk about in the first place. Samuel also tells Saul that you're going to find a group of prophets. You're going to go a certain way. You're going to run into a group of prophets. They're going to be prophesying, and you're going to be prophesying with them, which was something unusual necessarily for a king or even a judge. But this was going to be true of Samuel or Saul, the only time that we know of that this happened in his reign, before or after as well. And so that's exactly what happened. And the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. So at least in some way, and we can't explain all the differences perhaps, but in some way Saul became a different person here, a different man. He was set for a different job, the job of leading God's people. And so he cooperated with this. He's met these men. He did prophesy. And it was a source of confusion for the people in Israel who saw him. This was just a limited number of them. But when they saw him prophesying, they said, well, isn't this Saul, the son of Kish? They didn't understand why he would be doing that. But they were going to be finding out shortly thereafter when he was anointed. And so after, or when he was made king officially. And so Saul returned home to his father, and he said the donkeys are okay. They've been located. And as it turns out, his father was very, very glad to see him, and more so, in fact, than he was concerned about where the lost donkeys were. So shortly after this, it's time for the official and public recognition of Saul as king. The anointing had taken place, but the introductions had not taken place. And so Samuel called the people to the Lord, together to the Lord at Mizpah. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people?" So all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." Now this is what eventually happened. But of course, there's a side story that precedes this, because here at Mizpah, all the people had come forth to hear what was going to be said. Big announcement. This is the way it had to be communicated because everyone needed to know. And when Samuel was ready to announce, there's no Saul close by. And he's trying to figure out where Saul is. This is his big moment. He's going to be introduced. And it turns out the Lord tells Samuel that he's hiding among the equipment or the baggage, or other things are used in different translations. Literally, it was the stuff. He was hiding among the stuff. He was humble. He was reluctant to accept this, and he really was not excited about being part of what was about to happen. The stuff being perhaps all the things that people brought with them as they packed and unpacked there, as they came to Mizpah to hear this particular announcement that Samuel was going to give. Somewhere among there, Saul was hiding, but the Lord knew where he was. Samuel found him, and he was made king. And at first, there were a few who rejected him, who weren't ready to say, well, this is our king. But it wasn't long until he was indeed accepted. And we read more about that in chapter 11, because there's going to be a great victory. Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and he camped against Jabesh Gilead. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now, between the first sentence here and the last sentence, a number of things took place. We read that the Ammonite people came up against this city of basically just called Gilead most of the time. If you look on the map, that's probably what you will see. And they are seeking help. They send for help to Saul. And Saul calls the forces of Israel together. And they come forward in a good way, many, many thousands of them. And they have a great victory. And after this victory, it might be referred to as sort of the high point of Saul's reign, because he is accepted by all the people. He's just led a great victory, freed the city of Gilead, who was grateful to him, as we read on in the Old Testament history, grateful to him for this for many, many years later. We see here a map. We see where the Ammonites are located on the east side of the Jordan River, and the events taking place over on the west side of the Jordan River there, the cities of Gilgal and Ramah and Mizpah, the other places that we read about in these chapters that we're looking at. So they had come over. The city of Gibeah there was the one that was surrounded and in a desperate situation until Saul and his soldiers came and freed them. Then they went up to Gilgal for this celebration and further sacrifice to the Lord, and Saul was accepted by the people in a good way. Now, as we're coming nearer to the end of Samuel's influence with the people, it soon was going to be, having done everything that God wanted him to do, he makes an address there. And basically, it's a lot like the address that Moses made when he knew that Joshua was going to take over the leadership of the people before they crossed the Jordan, and he was not going to be there. Samuel says, "If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well." I've used the English Standard Version there as a translation because I believe it expresses the intent here of this verse a little bit better than some of the other translations. Samuel begins by asking the people, even before this, "Have I mistreated you at any time? Have I been a bad judge? Have I done these things wrong towards you?" And the people heartily say, "No, you haven't. We appreciate what you've done. You've been a good man in spite of the way that his sons turned out." And so he's again reminding them of their fathers and how many times their fathers did not obey God. They got into trouble, and God always was there to deliver them. And you would think that they would have learned from that. I read a quote just recently. In fact, I've seen it in a number of places. And the quote goes like this: "Learn from the mistakes of others, because you can't live long enough to make them all yourself." And so as we look at the Israelites here, we think, why didn't they learn from the mistakes that their forefathers had made and know that as long as they served God, things would be okay? And as we go down to the end of this chapter, the end of chapter 12, we see that Samuel is going to say that again. "Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." So what we have here is a choice that was given to God's people a number of times, and a choice that's given to us today. And that is, if we want to be blessed, we obey the voice of the Lord. We obey his commandments. And if we do not do that, then just as Samuel made the promise here, we know that things are not going to go well for us if we separate ourselves from God. Beginning with chapter 13, we find that Samuel begins a serious drifting away from the Lord as far as the Lord's will, and even Saul's own attitude toward obeying God as he should. Saul sacrifices presumptuously. That is, not the way that God wanted him to, not the way that God specifically had said it would be, but a way that he seemed to think personally was necessary. We're 2 years into Saul's reign as king here. So sadly, this attitude develops very, very early in his kingship. The Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So the Philistines come. In fact, they come to a place called Michmash, a place that is deep within Israel's territory. It's right at the heart of those cities in which the events about Samuel and Saul have taken place already. In other words, they were living in Israel. The army was there with everybody able to see it and surrounded by it, and they were very concerned about it. In fact, as we continue reading there, when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. We find out that while this is taking place at Michmash, the Philistine army is there. Over in Gilgal, Saul has gathered with those who were supporting him with an army of some size. And unfortunately, the people, it says, were trembling. They were afraid of the Philistines, even though they'd had a successful battle. Paul had led them, and Saul had led them in this battle, but they were still trembling, literally fearing this. Now, while they were there and everybody was hiding and wherever they could hide, and those who were still with Saul in Gilgal were trembling, we find out that Saul is waiting at Gilgal for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice. That was the way they would proceed, the sacrifice before God, asking for his blessings before they went into battle with the Philistines. And apparently, Saul had been promised by Samuel that in 7 days he would be there. And as it turned out, that after those 7 days, he had not shown up. And this is the occasion for the first real rebellion on Saul's part after these 7 days expired. Then he waited 7 days, he being Saul, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, "Bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me." And he went ahead and offered a sacrifice that was not to be done by someone who was not a priest. And Saul knew that, the people knew that, everybody knew that. But we notice here, as we jump down to verse 12, not long after he had offered this sacrifice, Samuel shows up and demands an explanation. And Saul gives this excuse. "Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." Now, that phrase, "felt compelled," might almost sound a little bit legitimate to us if we didn't know the background of what was going on and also the background of what he actually said there. Felt compelled is from a word that literally means, well, I didn't want to, but I forced myself. I made myself do this. I just had to do this. I couldn't help myself. In other words, because people were running off and hiding, they were afraid of the Philistines. Saul said, I've just got to do this. I know what God said about offering sacrifices, but I just can't help myself. I've got to do that. Well, this was a tragic mistake, of course, because it was a direct violation of God in a very, very public way, in a very, very wicked way. Verse 13, we find that Samuel tells him, "Saul, you have done foolishly." And then in verse 14, "Your kingdom shall not continue because of this." Well, Saul's kingdom was to continue for a number of more years, but he was not to enjoy the reign and the length of kingdom that perhaps could have been his as someone who served God the way that God wanted to be served. So what we have here is Saul offers this improper sacrifice, and the people are frightened. And the Philistine, a huge Philistine army with all these metal chariots, iron chariots, are waiting over at Michmash. We face Israel in a difficult situation because the text also tells us that the Philistines and their oppression of the Israelites would not allow a blacksmith to practice in Israel, which meant they basically had no metal weapons to fight with. In fact, the text tells us that only Saul and Jonathan were equipped in this way, which of course put the Philistines in a better position to be victorious over them. So the Philistines were waiting at Michmash, and we move forward to see what's going to happen. We see here, first of all, the bravery of Jonathan. Jonathan, the son of Saul, was a young man of apparently very different character than Saul was during these events we're about to look at here, and even looking ahead to the time when young David was going to show up on the scene. Jonathan conducts himself in every way as the kind of person that God would be pleased with. And so Jonathan is waiting like the rest of the army of Israel, and the Philistines are pretty well built up and ready to fight in this place called Michmash. They have a fortified area there that's going to be need to be conquered. And so Jonathan and his armor bearer set out 2 people against many, many Philistines. Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." Well, that's exactly what happened. Jonathan and his armor bearer go, and they go up to a place where it is really adjacent to the garrison of the Philistines. They make their way up. The Philistines see them. They make fun of them at first, and then there's a fight. And the Lord uses Jonathan and his armor bearer to be very victorious over many, many soldiers from the Philistine army who outnumber them. And because of this unplanned attack, eventually Saul and the rest of the people see what's going on, and they begin to attack as well. And there is confusion among the Philistines, and even though they're outnumbered and outweaponed in the battle, Israel is going to win this battle in a good way. Verse 20 tells us, "Then Saul and all the people who were with him assembled, and they went into battle." And I have here a photograph. This is what today is believed to be the actual location of the garrison. And you can see the valley there from which Jonathan and his armor bearer would have had to have climbed to go up and to fight the Philistines who were guarding that. Perhaps not as many as Philistines as there would have been, thinking this was a place that could not be conquered because of the terrain. So something like this is what Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed up, defeated the Philistines all the way up, and then, along with the others who joined the fight, won a great victory. Now, during the time of this victory being won, we see Saul's foolish oath. Saul further demonstrates his lack of judgment, not necessarily a pride problem here, but some sort of problem, as he makes an oath that he never should have made. And the men of Israel were distressed that day. This is during the battle, and they're pursuing the Philistines. They're winning. They're going to continue to win. For Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, "Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. It does seem to be a matter of Saul saying, "I want to conquer my enemies. I want to end this battle. I want to do everything that can be done." And it did seem to be somewhat of a personal goal of his, but he makes a very foolish statement. He says, "Nobody's going to eat anything." How are soldiers going to battle hour after hour after hour all day long when they do not have any sustenance? They don't even get to eat. And yet Paul made that oath to them, and it was going to be under the penalty of death, as it turned out. So the people, of course, obeyed that. And then as Jonathan is going along, again, with many of the other soldiers this time. He has not heard of this. And he's going along, and they're in a forest where there's a great deal of wild honey. This seems to be everywhere. And so Jonathan begins to eat of that and eat of that. And about the time he gets finished eating, someone says to him, your father said nobody's supposed to eat anything until this battle is over. He said not to do that. And Jonathan points out the folly of this foolish oath. How much better, he said, if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. In other words, how much greater the battle might have been if we had had completely strong soldiers instead of soldiers who were hungry, because they were very hungry. And in fact, when they did have the chance afterwards to eat, the text says they actually ate before the blood was out of the animals that they killed, which of course was not pleasing to God either. So after they return from the victory, return from this part of the victory, and Saul is trying to decide if he should continue into further battle with the Philistines, he asked God, should I continue? Should the battle go on? Should I go to where the Philistines are now? And he doesn't get an answer. He assumes that to be because someone has sinned. Someone has violated his oath of eating something before the battle is completed. And so they cast lots. And the lots come down to a particular tribe and family and clan and all of that. And eventually down to Jonathan and Saul, and then eventually to Jonathan. And he finds out that Jonathan has tasted of the honey against his orders. And it is his still foolish vow, and following up on that foolish vow, he says, Jonathan, you've got to die. You've disobeyed. God is displeased, which of course was not the case at all. And Saul would have, the text says, taken his son's life for that disobedience, except the people would not allow him. The people all rose up together and said, no, you can't kill Jonathan. He's the hero of today, and you cannot take his life. And so Jonathan's life was at that time spared. So Saul continues with military success as we move into chapter 14. He's won that battle. He's been successful before. And we have a message here that he, in many of his battles, he spreads out his territory. He overcomes the enemies that are all around them. In verse 47 of chapter 14, after a number of battles are mentioned, it says, so Saul established his sovereignty over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the people of Ammon, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Now, all of these people that are mentioned here that Saul was able to conquer, to defeat in battle and to conquer, and they served the king of Israel rather than having freedom themselves. All of them were surrounding Israel literally on every side, as the text said. And we have here a map that will help us to appreciate that. We see the Philistines over to the west of Israel along the seacoast beside the Mediterranean Sea. The Amalekites down south, somewhat between Israel and the path that would lead to Egypt. On the right side, we have three peoples who were continually problems, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites on the east side of the Jordan. And then up in the area there, Aram and Damascus is believed to be the area where the kings of Zobah, who are mentioned there in verse 47, so where they lived. And Saul was successful against all of these in his military pursuits, even though God did not necessarily approve of Saul. He'd already been found wanting, and he was going to have the kingdom taken from him at a future point, apparently for the sake of Israel, for the sake of his people, and perhaps preparing the kingdom for the next king, who would be David. He allows Saul to be successful in a military way and expands the borders of the kingdom. In chapter 15, we have one of the most familiar, perhaps, situations in which Saul fails to do the will of God and is rejected because of that. Now, he's already had a number of failures He's already been rebuked for it, and he's already going to face consequences for it. But this one is especially in God's face, especially something that all the people can see and know about, because he did this during and after a battle that God told him to go into. He's told to go and to fight the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites, at this time, their king was King Agag. The Amalekites had been a people perhaps distantly related to the Israelites through Esau and through Edom. We're not sure of that. But they had fought Israel as they made their way up from Egypt on the way to the Promised Land, out in the desert places on the map that we saw a moment ago. And they had tried to keep them from making it to the Promised Land. They had called for a prophet to curse them, and did everything they could, but were unsuccessful because God was with the people. And this was in punishment to them that God sent Saul and his army down to fight them. And in Exodus 17, we read about the battle that they had. Exodus 17, we find out that they had fought a battle in which Moses, sitting up on a hill, as long as his arms were raised with the staff that he led the people with, they were victorious. And Joshua led the victory. And it continued so long into the day that Moses was unable to hold his hands up. And so Aaron and Hur stood by his side and held his arms up, and the staff which he held in them. And as long as he held that up, there was a great battle, and they were totally successful against the Amalekites, to the extent that there was not a group of Amalekites anywhere. They spread and they fled in groups of one, as they were so completely defeated. And so now the Amalekites are going to be destroyed for that. However, when King Saul won this great victory, he did not destroy them completely, but rather he brought back the best of some things to be sacrificed. He brought back King Agag instead of killing him. In other words, he did not do what God had clearly told him to do. And so Samuel again approaches him and rebukes him because of this. And Samuel tries to make excuses about, I just did this and just did this. I mostly did the Lord's will. He said, well, the people wanted to do this. And so, I really couldn't stop them. And he brought them back to sacrifice, he said, the animals that he brought back. And here we have some really important advice that Samuel gives to Saul. And it's just as true today as it was in those days. So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Again, that was true then. What God wanted Saul to do was do what he said, not decide that God could be worshiped in some other way. God would be pleased with Saul making his own decisions about how to please God. When God said, this is what I want you to do, he meant it. And today, as we think about our service to God, our worship to God, all the ways in which we say, I want to please God, we need to remember King Saul, the mistake that he made, and what Samuel tells him here. Obeying is better than sacrifice. There's nothing that he could do, King Saul. There's nothing that we can do today to ad lib, to add to take away from, to substitute for what God has asked us to do in ways that will please him. We can't make it any better. We can't do something that he says, well, I wish I told him to do that. I would have preferred that even more. We can't do that. And so we would do well to remember this statement here in 1 Samuel 15:22. To obey is better than sacrifice, and then to heed the will of the Lord than the fat of rams. Hope that you will be with us for our next study as we continue on through the book of 1 Samuel. Hope this study has been of value to you. And again, this is the contact information if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to ask questions, give feedback, or just get in touch with us for whatever reason. We would love to hear from you. So thank you for being part of this study today.